Good morning, Arrow. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic, Amanda. Man, I got to tell you, what has the world looked like from 16 years ago compared to today? Because I'm one of those people that believes that when we write, we're speaking to a future self or a future reader. And I think this is one of those examples.
Yeah, it is wild how much has happened, right?
Yep.
In 16 years?
Yeah. I was afraid to go back into my daily writing because I've been doing that for 30 years. And it's like, I don't think you need to go back there. But you're teaching me that maybe there are lessons to learn here.
I mean, it's good and bad, Arrow. I'm not going to lie. Some things you look back at, you kind of cringe. And other things you're like, oh, man, wow, that's still true. That holds up. So it's wild.
One of the lessons that you teach in The Unthinkable is get to the solution quicker and smarter. That's my kind of street speak.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all benefit from, is knowing that no matter what else is happening, your brain will slow down and try to convince you that nothing bad is happening. Like you can lose a lot of time in this period of disbelief and denial. And so it's really been helpful to me to just know to expect that, because every disaster survivor I've ever interviewed is very consistent in saying their brain told them that nothing was wrong and just relax. And in fact, the room was filling with smoke or whatever it was. So knowing to expect that period of disbelief and push through it is really, really helpful.
How do you get people to understand that there is a solution? Because I work on this every single day. That I don't work at a grocery store. I go there so I can share solutions.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, look, there's kind of a paradox here, and it's important that we acknowledge it up front. Disasters are getting more frequent and more expensive. So at this point, in the past, 15 years, 90% of Americans lived in or very near a disaster zone, a federally declared disaster zone. Weather disasters have increased 400% in the past 50 years. And at the very same time, the number of deaths from disasters has dropped by 2/3 over the past 50 years. So disasters have gotten less disastrous, but much more frequent and expensive. And so there's a lot of hope embedded in there, right? It turns out that humans have gotten much better at working together to predict and forecast disasters and get out of harm's way in the nick of time. That is why disasters have gotten much less deadly. And we can talk more about that. But the critical thing here is that if we want to continue to make disasters more survivable, because they're not going away, right? They're going to continue to increase, whether they're tsunamis or wildfires or floods, we have to invest in understanding human behavior better. Yeah. And we have to build more trust with each other and with the people in charge and with our institutions, because otherwise all this really incredible technology and forecasting science that we've developed won't be that helpful.
It's so amazing that science has become such a major part of our lives just in the past 10 years. Before, it was just something that a bunch of nerds went and did. Nobody ever really talked about it. But now science is so valuable to us.
Yeah. And, it is specifically the human factor, understanding the neuroscience, the psychology, the sociology of humans, that for me is so wild and so important, because that is the real X factor in any disaster, that people don't behave the way they expect. It doesn't feel the way they think it will feel. It's often not as frightening in some ways and more frightening in other ways. There's a lot there, but understanding what you can expect from yourself and other people can be really reassuring and helpful.
When you allowed Reverend Samuel to begin your book, I mean, there's such a spiritual connection there. It's like, okay, this book is preparing me for something. I'm going to learn, and then I'm going to share. I'm going to activate it somehow, some way. So I thought that was a brilliant idea that you put Reverend Samuel in the beginning.
Well, I'm glad that you liked that, because part of me always wondered, should I have really started the book with a more kind of, knockdown, war games kind of scene, not sort of a massive disaster that most of us don't remember from 1917 when a ship blew up in Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia. Yes. But at the time, it was a really unprecedented event, because that ship that blew up was carrying more than 2,500 tons of explosives because it was headed to Europe for World War I. And so when it when it collided with another boat, the collision itself was not the catastrophe. And this is often how these things go. But what happened was the ship was a floating time bomb, right? So it blew up, and that caused the port to set fire, and one accident led to another, and it was the largest bomb explosion on record, shattering windows 60 miles away.
Really?
And then it caused a tidal wave, which swamped the shore. Then the fire crept across the city. I mean, it was just like one very bad day. Survivors saw like a black column of fire in the sky. And as you mentioned, at the time, there was an Anglican priest named Samuel Henry Prince who happened to be eating breakfast at a restaurant near the port. And he ran to help and opened up his church as a triage station. And he had actually also helped out when the Titanic had sunk just off the coast of Halifax a few years before. And he kind of marveled at how people behaved that day. He was really struck by the mysteries he saw. You know, he watched men and women endure crude sidewalk operations without obvious pain. How is that possible? Other people experienced full hallucinations. Details nagged at him. You know, why was the very first relief station that day set up by a troupe of actors, of all people, you know? And so he was the kind of person who noticed those things and was really curious about it. And he ended up, after he helped rebuild Halifax, he studied sociology. And for his PhD dissertation at Columbia, he deconstructed the Halifax explosion and really was the first person to study human behavior in disaster.
I love the way you go that deep into history, because now I don't feel like a nerd. Because when I'll get into a book like this, and it's like you'll say something, for instance, like, you know, when you're talking about the hostage and stuff, how do you get inside the mind, body, and soul of a hostage? Of course, I had to go do my own research as well. It's like I want to know more. I want to know more, and so you've got to be the same exact way.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that you keep going further. Yeah, and digging deeper. And I mean, that's where I feel most alive, right? Is when I'm curious, when something is surprising and also maybe a tiny bit hopeful. And that's where I found interviewing survivors, studying human behavior was something that could give us something to work with, right? Rather than just sitting here being afraid of each consecutive disaster, which is, you know, unfortunately how traditionally journalism covers these things. They're usually stories of fear and blame and grief. And those are important stories, but it's also really important to learn from these things and to see what did work and how we can do better.
Don't you think that our connection to content right now is due to things such as podcasts and special events on different networks that go longer than a 2-minute reel? Because when you talk about disaster, you also say that there's so many different definitions to it. There's no rush to tell us what they are, but we learn what they are. And it's because you took the time to do the research and now you're sharing it.
It's true. Having a little more time, and that is the beauty of podcasts, right? And I think one of the great moments of progress in our time is that we can have these deeper conversations, even as we are overstimulated and distracted. Yeah. Other times, there is still this ability to go a little bit deeper and try to not just tell stories, but learn from them.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, you really have a good quote in here that I want to put inside this studio. We are not damaged. We are survivors. Oh, my God.
Yeah, that was actually something that was written to me by a survivor.
Wow.
I wrote the original Unthinkable book 16 years ago, and a lot has happened since. And one of the most valuable things, of course, was learning from the people who read the book and reached out to me. And there were many, many people who learned from the book, but who also helped me understand what I'd missed. Who helped me do better and who helped me realize the different ways they could apply what I had learned in their own lives. But that particular one was a veteran who'd been injured in combat and wrote to complain that in the original book, I'd used the phrase damaged by war to describe people. And I'd used the phrase victims too many times. And she wrote, "We are not damaged. We are survivors." And I regret that wording, as I told her. So I've changed that in the new version of the book. And I refer to victims only when I'm writing about people who have been killed or when it's the only way that the word makes sense in that context. It's the only way to communicate. But there's a lot of ways that I, realized that I'd been kind of lumping people together as victims. And I think it's really important to learn from, the whole point of the book was to learn from survivors. So I was really grateful for that.
It's very fascinating to sit down with a survivor and just listen. And that, to me, is an art form where all you do is you listen and let them tell the story. And then we build from that, the paragraphs beyond that. How did you learn that art of listening?
I am always trying to get better at that, honestly. I feel like it is not something that most of us are very good at or trained in. And even as a journalist, I think we're often listening for a quote or listening for what we want to hear or the story that we want to tell. And that's not listening, right? So I feel like for me, the whole reason this book started is because I went to a 9/11 survivor support group meeting on the anniversary a few years after 9/11. And I had an expectation. I kind of was dreading going, honestly. I expected it to be yet another group of people who were, as I just said, damaged, right? Who were suffering, who were angry, who were grief-stricken, which would be understandable because I'd met a lot of those people and written their stories. But in fact, when I got there, I'll never forget it. I took the elevator up. Ironically, it was on a very high floor of a skyscraper in Times Square. And I got up there and these survivors, they were leaning in, like they had a bias for action. They wanted to go out and they were doing speaking tours at churches and schools. They wanted people to know what it was actually like in the stairwells, that it was not what they expected, that actually people were really courteous and cooperative, that they made mistakes, that they wish they had known that, for example, the roof would be locked, that they wish they had been in the stairwell before so they had some muscle memory for how to get down the stairs and how long it would take, because it took at least twice as long as safety engineers had predicted to get out of that building for a lot of reasons. But they had specific things that they had learned that they wished they had known and wanted the rest of us to know. And that was really exciting to hear and to try to share with the rest of us.
Tell you, one of the things that happened since 9/11 is that's when I became a martial artist, because I needed to know. I needed to know how to protect myself, my community. I needed to know more about my community. And I just that one moment in history changed so many people's lives. But the further we get away from it, the more people are starting to forget it. And we can't do that.
I love that you took that experience and found a way to be useful, to claim agency, to do something. Because I think too often we are not sure what to do. We're just kind of bombarded today with frightening news from all around the world and not given enough to do. So I think it is really important that people know. Let me take a small example. So most plane crashes are survivable. This is always a shock to people, right? Because that's not what we think. But the statistics are really clear. So of all the passengers involved in serious plane accidents between 1983 and 2017, 59% survived. So serious here means involving fire, severe injury, and substantial aircraft damage. So 59% survived. And here's the thing. The survival often depended on the behavior of the passengers. So these facts have been well known in the aviation industry for a long time. But most of us have no idea. And we think if that plane crashes, we're toast. It's over. And so realizing that we do have some agency, we do have some, that our behavior really matters. It may not be enough. It may not be all that matters, right? But it does matter. And that's really important to know, because I think then you take more responsibility for your own survival and the people around you. So very quickly, just to wrap that up, one of the things that I've learned from people who study plane crash behavior is when they themselves get on an airplane, they always count the number of rows between them and the nearest exit. Yep. Because they know that in a real plane crash, it ends up on the ground most of the time, on fire. You have to get off very quickly, and you can't see your hand in front of your face because of the smoke. The smoke is the whole event, and it's toxic because of what the plane's made out of. So being able to figure that out quickly is really, really helpful.
When you talk about the airplane right away, it takes me right back into the book. Does denial cause delay? Because, if I were on that airplane, I would have to make sure that I'm not in denial. This is really happening. Put yourself in a solution state of mind.
Absolutely. And that's hard to do when you're on an airplane, because as a passenger, you become really passive. We're just kind of herded around through TSA, and, you're not really you don't have a bias for action, right? And that's understandable. But we do know that people will on an airplane respond really well to aggressive leadership. So if you're in a plane crash, God forbid, very unlikely, but if it happens, you know that if you tell other people what to do, they will do it.
Yeah.
And that's what flight attendants are now trained to do. I did some training with them. And what they do is they yell very aggressively at the passengers, get off the plane, don't take your carry-on, go, go, go. And people generally react really well, and they're very compliant.
In martial arts, we call that vocal taekwondo, and we practice that. We really use our vocals to make sure that people are on the move. Because, instead of fighting a person, you can talk a person down just by using vocal taekwondo.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to use that. Vocal taekwondo. Vocal taekwondo. I love that. Yeah. No, it's true. And it's like, there's a void there often, of a leadership void. And if you do know something, if you know how to get out of a place, step into the void and you'll be surprised. People will follow you.
One of the things that I'm very fascinated with and still very lost about, and maybe you can, put some light on this, is that the younger generation, Alpha as well as Z, they'll sit there and you talk to them about what's going on in the world, the state of the world with the wars and things, and they're so optimistic, and yet the adult is so filled with fear. How the hell is this happening?
Right. And I think that's unfortunately one of the reasons, unfortunately for my profession of journalism, one of the reasons young people are tuning out of a lot of news, because it's not giving us solutions. It's not focused on what we can do. And I think that is starting to change. Like the most innovative newsrooms at the local level are doing a lot more solutions journalism and really rigorously covering what can be done. But often because it's younger people who are coming into those newsrooms and who are the audiences for those outlets. So I find that to be really exciting, because I personally, and it sounds like you too, just get sick of marinating in fear and despair. Like, that's just not how I want to live.
Yeah, see, and what I do is I revert to my pages, my daily writing. I do a defrag journal where I ask the question and question the answers, because this way I need it out of my head.
That is so smart. I love that word, defrag. Yes, that's how it feels. Like your brain needs to be defragged. And it's like getting it out of your head and onto paper is one of the most well-proven, scientifically validated ways to manage our own mental and physical health, right? Is to kind of find ways to process and express all of the emotions and feelings and thoughts and experiences that we have. So I wish I could do it every day. I would like to do it every day. That's a goal that I have. So you're inspiring me here.
Have we watered down these rescue dogs as well as emotional dogs? Because it seems like everywhere you go, everybody says, "Oh, this is my emotional dog." But is it? Have we watered it down to the point to where it's just not effective anymore?
I think it depends on the context, right? Like there is an increase of certain kinds of disasters and not others. There is a way in which we tend to fear the wrong things, right? As humans. A lot of what I spent time on the book doing is trying to understand, why do we fear the things we fear? Why do we clutch the things we clutch, right? In every disaster, people spend some time milling, which is like gathering things around them and bringing them, talking to people around them. And it's a very funny thing that we do. And it's not totally rational, even if it's understandable. But one of the things that was helpful to me to understand is that there's something, the technical term is dread. Dread is the word for why we value and fear some things over others. And dread is a kind of equation that we all carry around in our heads, right? And the equation for dread is varies depending on the person, but it's a little bit predictable. Wow. And the dread equation basically has to do with whether something is something that you're familiar with, or if it's really strange and new and scary to you, like a plane crash, right? And whether it feels uncontrollable to you. This is why people dread plane crashes more than a car crash, right? Even though car crashes are infinitely more likely, right?
Right.
Whether there's a sense of unfairness. So if something feels like a threat feels unfair, we're going to dread it more, right? So there's actual equation for dread. And once you understand what those factors are, then you can try to dial down some of those things for yourself. So if you live in a tornado alley, or you live in a tsunami inundation zone or on an earthquake fault line, the more you know about that threat from reliable sources, the less uncontrollable, unfamiliar, and unfair, and all of those things kind of go down a little bit. So then you can adjust your dread sensation and make it right-sized, right, for the threat. So that can be helpful.
My Sabanim endlessly would say, can you control it? Can you control it? And I would say, no, move on. And so it was like, wow, I'm free just by saying move on.
That is there's a lot in there, right? I mean, thousands of years of philosophy and prayer. But yes, if you can figure out what you can control and what you can't and let those things go. And I think that's where, for me, understanding some of the biggest threats I face are important, right? But then, there's an X factor, right? There's going to be things that happen that you can't anticipate. But what you can anticipate is human behavior. Yep. Like that's going to be fairly consistent across very different disasters.
Wow. Where can people go to find out more about you, Amanda, so they can get into your word and into your brilliant wisdom?
Well, that might be setting the bar too high, but you can find me at amandaripley.com or at Ripley Writer on Instagram.
Please come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you this morning. I appreciate it.
Well, you be brilliant, okay?
Take care. Thank you.